The small town of Cedar Ridge was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Every Saturday night, the community center came alive with the sound of fiddles and laughter as folks gathered for their weekly dance. Women would spend hours getting ready, fixing their hair just right and putting on their best dresses. The men would clean up nice too, hoping to catch the eye of someone special. But there was always one man who stood apart from the crowd. His name was Jake. And he was 32 years old with rough hands and a face that told stories of hard work and harder times. While other cowboys laughed loudly and spun the local girls around the dance floor, Jake would find himself a quiet spot near the refreshment table. He'd hold a cup of punch in his scarred hands and watch the festivities from a distance. Most people in Cedar Ridge had opinions about Jake, and none of them were particularly kind. They'd whisper behind his back about how he was difficult to work with, how he kept to himself too much, and how he had a temper that could flare up without warning. The truth was, most of these stories were built on half-truths and assumptions. But in a small town, gossip spreads faster than wildfire. Jake's troubles started years ago when he was working on the old Peterson ranch. A spooked horse had kicked him in the face, leaving him with a scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw. The accident had nearly cost him his eye, and it left him looking fierce even when he was feeling anything but. People started treating him differently after that, like the scar had changed who he was inside. Not just how he looked outside, work became harder to find. Ranch owners would take one look at him and decide they'd rather hire someone who wouldn't make their other workers nervous. Jake found himself taking the jobs nobody else wanted, working long hours for less pay, always proving himself over and over again. The loneliness of it all made him withdraw even more, which only fed the rumors about his antisocial ways. On this particular Saturday night in late spring, the community center was more crowded than usual. The winter had been long and hard, and everyone was eager to celebrate the warmer weather. Jake had almost decided not to come at all, but his old boss, Frank, had insisted he needed to get out more. "You can't spend every night alone in that cabin of yours," Frank had said. "You're still young, Jake. Don't let what happened define your whole life." So there Jake stood, nursing his punch and watching couples spin around the wooden floor. The local band was playing a lively tune, and the sound of boots on wood created a rhythm all its own. He recognized most of the faces in the crowd. There was Betty from the general store, dancing with Tom the blacksmith. The mayor's daughter was there with her new beau from the next town over. Everyone seemed to belong somewhere, except for him. When he noticed her, she was sitting at one of the small tables near the back wall, and she was clearly new in town. Jake had never seen her before, and in Cedar Ridge, that was saying something. She had light brown hair pinned up in a simple style and wore a modest blue dress that looked store-bought rather than homemade. What caught his attention wasn't just that she was pretty, though she certainly was, but that she looked just as out of place as he felt, while everyone else was caught up in the dancing and socializing. This woman was quietly observing everything around her. She had the look of someone trying to figure out where she fit in, and Jake recognized that feeling all too well. The woman kept glancing around the room like she was studying the people and their interactions. Every so often someone would approach her table and introduce themselves, but the conversation seemed forced and brief. Jake could tell she was being polite, but there was something in her posture that suggested she wasn't quite comfortable yet. As the evening wore on, Jake found himself watching her more than the dancers. He noticed how she smiled genuinely when old Mrs. Patterson struggled to get up from her chair, and how she immediately offered her own seat. He saw her help clean up when someone spilled their drink nearby, even though it wasn't her mess to worry about. These small acts of kindness painted a picture of someone with a good heart. Near the end of the evening, something happened that changed everything. Mrs. Patterson, who was well into her 70s, had been trying to make her way back to her table when she stumbled slightly. The music was loud, and most people were too caught up in their own conversations to notice. But Jake saw her struggle, and without thinking about it, he moved quickly across the room. "Let me help you there, Mrs. Patterson," he said softly. Offering her his arm for support, the old woman looked up at him with grateful eyes. Why, thank you, dear. These old legs aren't what they used to be. Jake guided her slowly back to her chair, making sure she was steady before letting go. Can I get you anything? Some water or maybe another piece of cake? Mrs. Patterson patted his hand affectionately. You're such a good boy, Jake. I don't care what the others say about you. Her words hit him harder than she probably intended. Jake's face flushed, and he quickly excused himself, heading back toward his spot by the refreshment table. But as he walked away, he felt eyes on him. Looking up, he met the gaze of the new woman in the blue dress. She had watched the entire interaction, and there was something in her expression that Jake couldn't quite read. It wasn't pity, which he was used to, or fear, which he'd also seen plenty of. It looked almost like curiosity, maybe even approval. For a moment, their eyes held across the crowded room. Jake felt his heart beat a little faster, but then he looked away, convinced he was imagining things. Women like her didn't notice men like him. Not in the way he was hoping, but the woman kept watching him for the rest of the evening. She saw how he stayed on the edges of conversations, how he was polite when spoken to, but never pushy. She noticed that he helped stack chairs when the dance was winding down, working quietly while others said their goodbyes. Most importantly, she had seen his genuine kindness toward Mrs. Patterson. When the evening finally ended and people began making their way home, Jake prepared for another lonely walk back to his small cabin on the outskirts of town. He pulled on his worn leather jacket and headed for the door, nodding politely to the few people who acknowledged him. As he stepped out into the cool night air, he heard a voice behind him. "Excuse me." Jake turned around to find the woman in the blue dress standing in the doorway of the community center. Up close, she was even prettier than he'd thought, with kind eyes and a warm smile that seemed completely genuine. "I wanted to thank you," she said, stepping closer, "for helping Mrs. Patterson tonight. That was very sweet of you." Jake felt his face grow warm. "It was nothing, ma'am. Anyone would have done the same." "Actually," she said with a slight smile, "I don't think that's true. I watched, and you were the only one who noticed she needed help." They stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, both unsure what to say next. Finally, the woman extended her hand. "I'm Lisa. I just moved here last week to teach at the school." Jake looked at her offered hand for a moment before taking it gently in his own. "Jake Thompson. Welcome to Cedar Ridge, Miss Lisa." And with that simple introduction, both their lives were about to change in ways neither of them could have imagined. The next few weeks in Cedar Ridge brought whispers and raised eyebrows wherever Lisa went. Word had spread quickly about her conversation with Jake after the dance. And in a town where everyone minded everyone else's business, this was big news. Indeed, at general store, Betty would lean across the counter and ask in hushed tones, "Now, honey, you do know about that Thompson boy, don't you?" When Lisa picked up supplies for her classroom, the store owner would shake his head and mutter warnings about keeping bad company. Even the pastor's wife felt it necessary to pull Lisa aside after Sunday service to share her concerns about certain members of the community, but Lisa had always been the type to make up her own mind about people. Back home in Denver, her friends used to tease her about being too trusting, but she believed there was good in everyone if you just took the time to look for it. The more people warned her about Jake, the more curious she became about the man behind the reputation. It was a Tuesday afternoon when she saw him again. Lisa had been walking home from the schoolhouse, carrying a stack of books that needed mending, when she noticed a familiar figure sitting alone on a bench outside the post office. Jake was reading what looked like a well-worn book, completely absorbed in whatever story had captured his attention. Most people would have crossed the street or found an excuse to avoid an awkward encounter. But Lisa had never been most people. She walked right up to him, her stack of books balanced carefully in her arms. "Good afternoon, Jake," she said with a warm smile. He looked up, startled, and quickly closed his book. "Oh, hello, Miss Lisa. Didn't see you there. What are you reading?" she asked, genuinely curious. Jake hesitated, like he wasn't sure whether to answer. Finally, he held up the book so she could see the cover. It was a collection of poetry by Walt Whitman, the pages yellowed and soft from years of handling. Lisa's Eyebrows shot up in surprise. This was definitely not what she'd expected from the cowboy everyone called antisocial and difficult. Whitman, I love his work. Which poem is your favorite? For the first time since she'd known him, Jake's face lit up with something close to excitement. Well, I've always been partial to Song of Myself. The way he writes about finding beauty in ordinary things, it speaks to me, I guess. They ended up talking for nearly an hour about books and poetry, sitting on that bench while the afternoon sun moved across the sky. Lisa discovered that Jake had taught himself to read better by working through classic literature, and that he had strong opinions about everything from Shakespeare to Mark Twain. When she mentioned that some of her students were struggling with reading, Jake quietly suggested a few techniques that had helped him. You know, Lisa said as she finally gathered her books to leave, I walk this route every Tuesday and Thursday after school. Same time, same path. Jake caught the hint in her words and felt his heart skip a beat. Is that so? It is indeed, she replied with a knowing smile. A person might run into me quite regularly if they happen to be in the area. From that day forward, Jake made sure he had business near the post office every Tuesday and Thursday at 3:30. Sometimes he'd be checking for mail that rarely came, other times he'd be sitting on that same bench with a book. Without ever formally arranging it, they began meeting regularly for these afternoon conversations. Their talks ranged from literature to life philosophy, from funny stories about Lisa's students to Jake's observations about ranch work and the changing seasons. Lisa learned that Jake had opinions about everything and wasn't afraid to share them, but he also listened carefully to what she had to say. He asked thoughtful questions and remembered details from their previous conversations after a few weeks. Of these chance encounters, Jake worked up the courage to suggest something more formal. There's a real pretty spot up by Miller's Creek, he said one Thursday afternoon. Peaceful place, good for thinking. Would you maybe like to see it? We could bring lunch, make an afternoon of it. Lisa's face broke into a wide grin. I'd love that, Jake. When were you thinking? Saturday afternoon? I could pick you up around noon if that suits you. Word of their planned picnic spread through Cedar Ridge faster than smoke from a grass fire. Lisa's landlady, Mrs. Henderson, took it upon herself to have a serious talk with her young tenant about the dangers of being alone with men of questionable character. The bank president's wife stopped by the school to share her concerns about Lisa's judgment. Even some of the other teachers felt obligated to voice their opinions. I just don't understand what you see in him, said Carolyn, the teacher who'd been in Cedar Ridge the longest. There are plenty of nice, respectable men in this town. Why choose the one with such a troubled reputation? But Lisa had seen something in Jake that others seemed to miss entirely. Yes, he was quiet and kept to himself, but she'd come to understand that his reserve came from years of being treated like an outsider, not from any meanness in his heart. He was thoughtful and well-read, gentle in his manner, and had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh. Saturday arrived bright and clear, perfect weather for a picnic. Jake showed up at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house exactly at noon, wearing his cleanest shirt and carrying a worn leather satchel. Lisa had prepared fried chicken and biscuits, while Jake had brought fresh fruit from his small garden and a thermos of coffee. The ride to Miller's Creek took about 20 minutes on horseback. Jake had borrowed a gentle marais for Lisa and rode his own horse, a steady old gelding named Copper. As they made their way along the winding trail, Jake pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the area's history. Miller's Creek turned out to be everything Jake had promised. A clear stream bubbled over smooth rocks, surrounded by tall grass and wildflowers. Ancient oak trees provided shade, and the whole place felt like it existed outside of time. They spread their blanket near the water's edge and unpacked their lunch. How did you find this place? Lisa asked, settling herself on the blanket. I used to come here when I was younger, Jake replied, his voice softer than usual. Whenever things got difficult at home or work, this was where I'd come to think things through. It's peaceful here, helps a person get perspective. They ate their lunch slowly, talking about everything and nothing. Jake told her stories about growing up on the outskirts of town, about learning to work with horses and cattle from his grandfather. Lisa shared memories of her childhood in Denver, her decision to become a teacher, and her hopes for making a difference in her students' lives. As the afternoon wore on, they found themselves lying on their backs, looking up at the clouds and trying to identify shapes in the ever-changing formations. It was during one of these comfortable silences that Jake surprised her with a question. "Why did you talk to me that first night?" he asked. "At the dance, I mean. Most folks around here cross the street when they see me coming." Lisa turned on her side to face him. "Because I saw how kind you were to Mrs. Patterson, and because you looked like you understood what it felt like to not quite fit in somewhere." "Do you fit in, I mean?" Lisa considered the question seriously. "Not yet. Maybe not ever the way people expect. But I'm starting to think that might not be such a bad thing." They talked until the sun began to set, and Jake knew he needed to get Lisa back to town before dark. As they packed up their things, both of them felt like something important had shifted between them. This hadn't been just a friendly outing anymore. It had been something deeper, something that promised more afternoons like this one on the ride back to town. Lisa made a decision that would set tongues wagging for weeks to come. "Jake," she said as they approached the main street, "would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow after church? I could cook something nice." Jake nearly fell off his horse. A woman inviting a man to dinner was serious business in Cedar Ridge, the kind of thing that indicated intentions beyond casual friendship. "Are you sure about that, Miss Lisa? People are going to talk." Lisa's smile was radiant in the gathering twilight. "Let them talk, Jake. I've never been one to live my life according to other people's opinions." And just like that, their unlikely courtship moved to the next level, scandal and all. 6 months of Sunday dinners, evening walks, and stolen moments by Miller's Creek had changed everything for Jake and Lisa. What started as curious conversations had grown into something neither of them had expected to find in a small town like Cedar Ridge. They'd fallen in love. Pure and simple, despite every warning and whispered concern from the people around them. When Jake finally asked Lisa to marry him on a crisp October evening, she didn't hesitate for even a second. They were sitting on their favorite fallen log by the creek, watching the autumn leaves drift down onto the water, when he pulled out a simple gold ring that had belonged to his grandmother. "I know I'm not what most folks would call a good catch," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "And I know your family back in Denver probably had bigger plans for you. But Lisa, I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. Would you consider being my wife?" Lisa's answer came through happy tears. "Yes, Jake Thompson. Yes, 1,000 times yes." But if they thought their courtship had caused talk in Cedar Ridge, their engagement announcement sent shockwaves through the entire community. The news spread like wildfire, and suddenly everyone had an opinion about Lisa's decision to tie herself to the town's most misunderstood bachelor. At the general store, conversations would stop dead when Lisa walked in. Groups of women would break apart, their whispered discussions clearly about her and her questionable choice in men. The bank president's wife made pointed comments about how some people just couldn't be helped, no matter how much good advice they received. Even the pastor seemed uncomfortable when Lisa approached him about performing the ceremony. "Now, Miss Lisa," Pastor Williams said carefully, "marriage is a sacred commitment that shouldn't be entered into lightly. Are you quite certain you've thought this through completely?" Lisa's patience was wearing thin with all the unsolicited advice. "Pastor Williams, I've been thinking about this for months. I know exactly what I'm doing. It's just that Jake has a certain reputation in this town, and some of the congregation have expressed concerns about ... About what, exactly?" Lisa interrupted, her teacher voice coming out in full force. "About the fact that he's kind and intelligent and treats me with more respect than anyone else in this town ever has." The pastor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Well, there have been stories about his temper, and his family situation isn't exactly ... His family situation?" Lisa's voice rose slightly. You mean the fact that his parents died when he was 16 and he's been taking care of himself ever since? Or that he works harder than any 3 men in this county just to make an honest living? Despite the pastor's reservations, he eventually agreed to perform the ceremony. But Lisa could tell his heart wasn't in it, and she knew their wedding wouldn't be the joyful celebration most couples dreamed of. Jake's side of the guest list was painfully short. His only real friend was Frank, the old ranch foreman who'd been like a father to him after his parents passed. Frank had agreed to stand as Jake's best man, and he was genuinely happy about the engagement. But even he had quietly expressed concerns about whether Lisa truly understood what she was getting into. "Don't get me wrong, son," Frank had said one evening as they finished up work in the barn. "That girl's got more sense and backbone than most women in this county. But marriage is hard enough when everyone's rooting for you. When the whole town thinks you're making a mistake, well, that puts extra pressure on things." Jake had been thinking the same thing himself, though he tried not to let it show. Sometimes late at night, he'd lie awake wondering if he was being selfish by asking Lisa to marry him. He knew what people said about him, knew that being his wife would make her an outsider in ways she probably hadn't fully considered yet. Lisa's family situation was complicated in a different way. When she'd written to her parents in Denver about her engagement, the response had been swift and decidedly cool. Her mother had written back immediately, begging Lisa to reconsider and come home where she could meet someone more suitable. Her father had been even more direct, threatening to cut off all communication if she went through with what he called this foolish mistake. The letter that hurt the most came from her sister Rebecca, who'd always been her closest confidant. "Lisa, honey, I know you think you love this man, but you're throwing your life away. Come home before it's too late. There are plenty of good men here who would be thrilled to marry someone like you." But Lisa had made her choice, and she wasn't backing down. She'd seen the real Jake Thompson, the man who brought her wildflowers. For no reason, who remembered every story she told about her students, who could discuss literature with the passion of a scholar and then turn around and gentle a frightened horse with infinite patience. The rest of the world could think what they wanted. Planning the wedding became an exercise in managing other people's disapproval. The florist suddenly found herself too busy to handle the arrangements. The woman who baked cakes for most of the town celebrations claimed she was booked solid for the next 6 months. Even finding someone to play music for the ceremony proved challenging. Lisa ended up doing most of the work herself, with help from Mrs. Patterson. The elderly woman Jake had assisted at the dance where they first met, Mrs. Patterson had taken a shine to both of them and was one of the few people in town who openly supported their union. "Don't you pay any mind to these busybodies?" Mrs. Patterson told Lisa as they worked together to make simple flower arrangements. "I've been watching that boy for years, and I know a good heart when I see one. You're getting yourself a fine man, honey." The wedding was set for a Saturday afternoon in early December. Lisa had chosen a simple cream-colored dress that she'd ordered from a catalog, and Jake had invested in his first real suit, a navy blue outfit that made his eyes look even bluer than usual, the morning of the wedding. Lisa woke up in Mrs. Henderson's boarding house feeling a mixture of excitement and sadness. This should have been one of the happiest days of her life, but the absence of her family cast a shadow over everything. She'd received no word from Denver, no last-minute change of heart from her parents. At the small church, the congregation was notably sparse. Maybe 20 people had shown up, and half of them looked like they were attending a funeral rather than a wedding. Lisa walked down the aisle alone, carrying a simple bouquet of winter roses that Mrs. Patterson had somehow managed to find, but when she saw Jake waiting for her at the altar, none of the rest of it mattered. He looked nervous and handsome and completely overwhelmed by the sight of her in her wedding dress. Frank stood beside him, beaming with pride. And for a moment Lisa felt like everything was exactly as it should be. The ceremony itself was brief and simple. Pastor Williams got through the traditional vows without much enthusiasm, but when it came time for Jake and Lisa to exchange their personal promises, the atmosphere in the small church shifted. "Lisa," Jake said, his voice steady, "despite his nerves, I promise to love you and protect you and never give you cause to regret this day." I know folks think you're making a mistake, but I swear I'll spend every day proving them wrong. Lisa's voice was clear and strong when she responded. Jake Thompson, I promise to stand by you no matter what anyone else says or thinks. You've, shown me what real love looks like, and I wouldn't trade that for all the approval in the world. When Pastor Williams finally pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was gentle and full of hope. But as they turned to face their small congregation, Lisa could see the doubt in most of the faces looking back at them. The reception was held in the church's fellowship hall, and it was about as subdued as a wedding celebration could be. People made polite conversation and picked at the simple meal Lisa had prepared herself, but the atmosphere felt strained. Conversations died when the newlyweds approached, and more than once, Lisa caught people shaking their heads sadly. Frank gave a heartfelt toast about second chances and not judging books by their covers, but even his words seemed to highlight how isolated Jake and Lisa were from the rest of the community. When the elderly foreman finished speaking, the silence that followed was uncomfortable and long as the afternoon wore on and guests began making their excuses to leave early. Lisa felt a growing sense of determination rather than disappointment. Let them doubt. Let them whisper and worry about her choices. She knew something they didn't know. Something they couldn't see past their prejudices and assumptions. She knew Jake Thompson's heart, and that was worth more than all their approval combined. When the last guest had gone and they were finally alone, Jake took his new wife's hand and looked into her eyes with an expression of pure gratitude. "No regrets?" he asked softly. Lisa smiled and stood on her tiptoes to kiss her husband. "Not a single one, Mr. Thompson, not a single one." But as they drove away from the church toward their new life together, both of them knew the real test was just beginning. In a town that had already decided their marriage was doomed to fail, they would have to prove everyone wrong, one day at a time. The first few months of married life in the small cabin on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge were everything Lisa had hoped they would be. Jake proved to be a thoughtful husband who brought her coffee in bed every morning and never forgot to ask about her day when he came home from work. They spent their evenings reading together by the fireplace, sharing stories and dreams for their future. But as winter gave way to spring, Lisa began to notice small changes in Jake's behavior that made her feel uneasy. It started with the way he would sometimes drift off during their conversations, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. When she'd ask what he was thinking about, he'd just smile and say it was nothing important. Then there were the evenings, when he'd disappear into the old barn behind their cabin right after dinner. At first he'd explain that he was just doing some repairs or organizing his tools. Lisa thought nothing of it since the barn was ancient and probably needed constant work to keep it from falling down. "Just fixing up some loose boards," he'd say, kissing her forehead before heading out with his toolbox. "Won't be long." But as the weeks passed, these trips to the barn became more frequent and lasted longer. Jake would vanish for 2 or 3 hours at a time, coming back to the house with sawdust in his hair and a distant look in his eyes. When Lisa offered to help or suggested they spend the evening together instead, Jake would politely decline. "It's boring work, sweetheart," he'd tell her. "Nothing you'd want to be bothered with? Besides, it's getting chilly out there now that the sun's going down." Lisa tried not to read too much into it at first. Men had their projects, after all, and Jake had always been handy with tools. But there was something secretive about the way he talked about his barn work that didn't sit right with her. He'd never been secretive about anything else during their courtship or marriage. The mystery deepened when packages started arriving at their cabin. The first one came on a Tuesday morning while Jake was out working at the Peterson Ranch. The delivery man said it was addressed to Jake Thompson, and when Lisa asked what was inside, the man just shrugged and said it felt like wood pieces. When Jake came home that evening, Lisa mentioned the delivery. His reaction was strange. He seemed almost nervous as he carried the package out to the barn without opening it in front of her. "Just some supplies for the repair work I'm doing," he explained, but he wouldn't meet her eyes when he said it. More packages followed over the next few weeks. Some contained what sounded like more wood pieces when Lisa shook them gently. Others were softer, maybe fabric or padding of some kind. A few were small and heavy, possibly metal tools or hardware. Each time, Jake would take them straight to the barn without explanation. Lisa's curiosity grew stronger with each mysterious delivery. What kind of barn repairs required so many different materials? And why was Jake being so secretive about something? As simple as fixing up an old building? One evening, she decided to ask directly. They were sitting at their small kitchen table after dinner, and Jake was reading the local newspaper. Lisa had been washing the dishes, but she dried her hands and sat down across from him. "Jake, honey, can I ask you something?" He looked up from his paper with a smile. "Of course, what's on your mind? What exactly are you building out there in the barn?" The question hung in the air between them. Jake's smile faded, and Lisa could see him choosing his words carefully. "I told you I'm just making some repairs, fixing things up. But all those packages and the time you're spending out there ... it seems like more than just repairs." Jake folded his newspaper and set it aside. "Lisa, it's really nothing for you to worry about. Just a project I'm working on to keep myself busy in the evenings. But why can't you tell me what it is?" "We're married, Jake. We're supposed to share things with each other." For a moment, Jake looked like he wanted to say something more. His mouth opened slightly, and Lisa thought he might finally explain what was going on, but then he seemed to think better of it. "It's a surprise," he said finally. "Something I'm making for ... for later. Trust me, Lisa. When the time is right, you'll understand." That answer only made Lisa more confused and worried. A surprise for later? What did that mean? And why did Jake look so uncomfortable talking about it? The town's gossips, of course, had plenty of theories about Jake's mysterious barn activities. Mrs. Henderson, Lisa's former landlady, made sure to share the latest rumors whenever she ran into Lisa at the general store. "People are saying he's building some kind of cage out there," Mrs. Henderson whispered conspiratorially. "Maybe for trapping animals or worse. You know how those mountain men can get, living so far from civilization." Betty from the general store had heard a different story. "My cousin's husband saw Jake buying all sorts of fancy materials at the lumber yard in the next town over. Said it looked like he was planning something big. Maybe he's fixing to leave Cedar Ridge and didn't want to tell you until everything was ready." These rumors and whispers followed Lisa everywhere she went. At the schoolhouse, some of the other teachers would give her sympathetic looks and ask if everything was all right at home. Even some of her students' parents seemed to be watching her more carefully, like they were waiting for signs of trouble. The worst part was that Lisa found herself starting to wonder if maybe the town gossips were right to be concerned. Jake had always been honest with her before, but now he was clearly keeping secrets. What if there was something darker behind his mysterious behavior? Late at night, lying in bed beside her sleeping husband, Lisa would stare at the ceiling and worry. She'd married Jake despite everyone's warnings, believing she knew his character better than anyone else. But what if she'd been wrong? What if there really was something dangerous or unstable about him that she'd been too blind to see? The doubts grew stronger when she noticed that Jake had started locking the barn. He'd never bothered with locks before, but now there was a heavy padlock securing the door whenever he wasn't inside working. When Lisa asked about it, Jake said he was just protecting his tools from thieves. But Cedar Ridge wasn't the kind of place where people worried much about theft. One afternoon, Lisa walked out to the barn while Jake was at work, thinking she might peek through the windows to get some idea of what he was doing in there. But she discovered that Jake had hung heavy canvas over all the windows, blocking any view of the interior. The secrecy was becoming more elaborate, and that scared her more than she wanted to admit. The breaking point came on a Saturday evening in late April. Jake had finished dinner quickly and headed out to the barn as usual, claiming he wanted to get some work done before it got too dark. Lisa watched him go, feeling a familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. She tried to distract herself by reading, but the words on the page kept blurring together. Finally, she set her book aside and walked to the kitchen window that faced the barn. She could see light glowing from inside, and she could hear the sound of Jake working, hammering, sawing, moving things around. But there was something else, too. Every now and then she could swear she heard Jake talking to himself. Not just muttering or humming while he worked, but actual conversations. Like he was talking to someone else who was in there with him. The thought sent a chill down Lisa's spine. Who could Jake be talking to? And why would he have someone else in the barn with him when he'd always insisted his projects were private? Standing at that kitchen window, listening to her husband's voice drifting across the yard, Lisa felt her world starting to shift. The man she'd married, the man she'd defended against an entire town's worth of suspicion, was keeping secrets from her, big secrets. Dangerous secrets, maybe. For the first time since their wedding day, Lisa found herself wondering if everyone else had been right about Jake Thompson all along. Maybe there really was something dark and troubling about the man. She'd chosen to spend her life with Dot as the light in the barn finally went out and Jake made his way back to the house. Lisa hurried away from the window and pretended to be reading again. When he came through the door, she looked up with what she hoped was a normal smile. "How did the work go tonight?" she asked, her voice sounding strained even to her own ears. Jake's response was the same as always. "Fine, just fine." Making good progress. But as he kissed her goodnight and headed toward their bedroom, Lisa noticed something she'd missed before. There was something different in Jake's eyes when he talked about his barn work. Something that looked almost like guilt. That night, as Jake slept peacefully beside her, Lisa lay awake planning. She couldn't live with the uncertainty anymore. She needed to know what her husband was really doing out there in that barn, even if the truth turned out to be something she didn't want to hear. Tomorrow, she decided she would find a way to discover Jake's secret once and for all. Lisa's plan to discover Jake's secret proved harder to execute than she'd imagined. Her husband's work schedule was unpredictable, and he seemed to have developed an almost supernatural awareness of her whereabouts. Every time she thought she might have a chance to investigate the barn, Jake would either come home early or find some reason to stay close to the cabin. The stress of living with such uncertainty began to show on Lisa's face. Dark circles appeared under her eyes from too many sleepless nights, and she found herself distracted during her teaching duties. Her students noticed the change in their usually cheerful teacher, and several of them asked if she was feeling sick. "Mrs. Thompson looks real tired lately," 8-year-old Tommy whispered to his desk partner during an arithmetic lesson. "Maybe she's got the same thing my mama had when she was expecting my baby sister." Word of Lisa's apparent exhaustion spread quickly through the small community of Cedar Ridge. In a town where everyone watched everyone else's business, a young married woman looking pale and distracted could only mean one thing to the local. Gossips. The speculation started innocently enough, Mrs. Henderson mentioned to Betty at the general store that Lisa had looked quite peaked when she'd seen her at church last Sunday. Betty shared this observation with the pastor's wife, who passed it along to the ladies' auxiliary meeting. Before long, half the town was convinced that Lisa Thompson was expecting her first child, but this potential good news quickly took a darker turn when people remembered the mysterious activities happening in Jake's barn. If Lisa was pregnant, the reasoning went, then Jake's secretive behavior became even more sinister. What kind of man hides things from his wife when she's carrying his child? The rumors started flying faster than autumn leaves in a windstorm. At the post office, people whispered that Jake was probably building something dangerous that could hurt a pregnant woman. Outside the church after Sunday service, concerned citizens shared their theories about what dark purpose that locked barn might serve. "I heard from my neighbor that there's been strange sounds coming from that barn late at night," said Mrs. Cooper, the mayor's wife, hammering and sawing at all hours. What kind of man works like that when his wife needs her rest? Carolyn, the teacher who had always disapproved of Lisa's marriage, was particularly vocal in her concerns. She made it her mission to corner Lisa after school one afternoon and share what she called friendly advice. "Lisa, honey," Carolyn said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "everyone in town is worried about you. You don't look well. And with Jake acting so strange lately, people are starting to wonder if you're safe out there." Lisa felt her temper rising. "Safe? What exactly are you suggesting, Carolyn?" "Well, you have to admit his behavior has been odd. All that secret work in the barn, Those packages arriving, the way he won't tell you what he's doing. It's not normal, Lisa. A good husband doesn't keep secrets from his wife, especially not when she might be in a delicate condition. The phrase delicate condition made Lisa's blood boil. I don't know what you think you know about my personal life, Carolyn, but I can assure you that my husband and I are perfectly fine. But Carolyn wasn't finished. Lisa, I've been teaching in this town for 15 years. I've seen what happens when women ignore the warning signs. That man has always been trouble, and now that you're tied to him, you might not be thinking clearly about the danger you could be in. This conversation was repeated in various forms all over Cedar Ridge, well-meaning. Neighbors approached Lisa with their concerns. Fellow teachers pulled her aside to share their worries. Even some of her students' parents found excuses to visit the schoolhouse and ask pointed questions about her home life. The attention was suffocating. But what made it worse was that Lisa couldn't honestly defend Jake's behavior. She couldn't explain what he was doing in the barn because she didn't know herself. Every time someone expressed concern about his secretiveness, she found herself without good answers. Frank, Jake's old boss and best friend, heard the rumors. 2. One evening, he rode out to the Thompson cabin to check on the couple. Lisa was grateful to see a friendly face, but even Frank seemed troubled by what he'd been hearing in town. Jake's always been a private person, Frank said carefully, as they sat on the cabin's small porch. But folks are saying he's acting stranger than usual. Is everything all right between you two? Lisa wanted desperately to confide in someone, but loyalty to her husband held her back. We're fine, Frank, really. People in this town just love to talk. Frank studied her face for a long moment. Lisa, I think the world of Jake. He's like a son to me. But if something's wrong, if you're worried about anything at all, you can come to me. You don't have to handle things alone. The kindness in Frank's voice almost broke Lisa's resolve. She came so close to telling him about her fears and suspicions that the words were already forming on her lips. But at the last moment, she held back. Thank you, Frank, that means a lot. But honestly, everything is fine. Frank didn't look convinced, but he didn't push further. As he prepared to leave, he gave Lisa one last piece of advice. Marriage is hard work, even under the best circumstances. Don't let pride keep you from asking for help if you need it. After Frank left, Lisa felt more isolated than ever. Even Jake's closest friend was expressing concern about their situation. If Frank, who knew Jake better than anyone, was worried, maybe there really was something seriously wrong. The breaking point came during a particularly difficult day at school. Lisa had been struggling to focus on her lessons, and several students had misbehaved as a result. When the school day finally ended, she was gathering her things when she overheard a conversation between two mothers who had come to pick up their children. I feel so sorry for that poor girl, one of them was saying. Marrying the Thompson man was bad enough, but now with a baby coming and him acting so strange, she's really trapped. My husband says Jake's been buying supplies that don't make sense for normal barn repairs, the other mother replied. Hardware and chains and such. Who knows what he's planning to do with those things? And her looking so pale and sickly lately. I wonder if she's getting enough to eat or if he's making her work too hard. You know how those isolated types can be with their wives? Lisa couldn't take any more. She dropped her school books and rushed out of the building, tears streaming down her face. The rumors had taken on a life of their own, growing more elaborate and damaging with each telling. Now, people weren't just questioning Jake's character, they were suggesting he might be abusing his pregnant wife. The worst part was that Lisa wasn't even pregnant. The stress and sleepless nights had simply made her look unwell, but the town had jumped to its own conclusions and built an entire narrative around their assumptions. That evening, Jake came home to find his wife sitting at their kitchen table, crying into her hands. He immediately rushed to her side, his face filled with concern. Lisa, sweetheart, what's wrong? Are you hurt? Are you sick? Through her tears, Lisa told him about the rumors, the whispered conversations, the way people looked at her with pity and fear. She explained how the entire town seemed convinced that she was pregnant and that he was some kind of dangerous husband who couldn't be trusted. Jake's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, anger, hurt, and finally something that looked almost like guilt. Lisa, none of that is true, right? I would never hurt you or keep anything from you that could cause you harm. Do I know that, Jake? Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because honestly, I don't know what to think anymore. You disappear into that barn for hours every night. You won't tell me what you're doing. Packages arrive that you hide from me? You've put locks on doors and covered windows. How am I supposed to feel about all of this? Jake sat down heavily in the chair across from her. For a long moment he didn't speak, just stared at his hands folded on the table. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with pain. I never wanted you to feel this way, he said quietly. Everything I'm doing, it's because I love you. But I can see now that keeping secrets, even with the best intentions, was a mistake. Then tell me, Lisa pleaded. Tell me what's in that barn. Tell me why you've been acting so strange. Help me understand so I can defend you against all these awful rumors. Jake seemed to wrestle with himself for several long minutes. Lisa could see the internal battle playing out on his face, the desire to explain warring against some other impulse that kept him silent. Finally, he reached across the table and took her hands in his. Lisa, I promise you that what I'm doing in that barn has nothing to do with anything dangerous or harmful. It's actually something good, something hopeful. But I'm not ready to show you yet. Can you trust me just a little longer? Lisa wanted to trust him. She loved him desperately and wanted to believe that there was an innocent explanation for everything that had been happening. But the weight of the town's suspicions and her own fears was becoming too much to bear. How much longer, Jake? Because I don't think I can live like this much more. The whole town thinks you're dangerous, and I'm either too naive or too scared to see it. I'm starting to wonder if maybe they're right. The pain that flashed across Jake's face at those words was almost physical. The tension in the Thompson household had become unbearable. 3 days had passed since Lisa's tearful confrontation with Jake, and neither of them seemed to know how to bridge the growing gap between them. Jake continued his evening trips to the barn, but now his departures felt heavy with unspoken words and mounting suspicion. Lisa found herself watching the clock each evening, counting the minutes until Jake would kiss her forehead and make his usual excuse about checking on his projects. The routine that had once seemed quirky now felt like a betrayal. Each night, she would sit alone in their small living room, listening to the sounds, drifting from the barn and wondering what her husband was really doing out there. The rumors in town had grown even worse. Now people weren't just whispering about Jake's mysterious behavior, they were openly speculating about when Lisa would finally see sense and leave him. At the general store, conversations would stop abruptly when she entered, only to resume in hushed tones after she passed. The sympathetic looks had been replaced by something closer to pity, as if people had already written off her marriage as doomed. Mrs. Cooper, the mayor's wife, had even approached Lisa after church with what she called a generous offer. My sister in Denver has a spare room, Mrs. Cooper had said, her voice dripping with false concern. If you ever need somewhere safe to go, somewhere to think things through, the offer is there. Sometimes a woman needs to get some distance before she can see her situation clearly. Lisa had politely declined, but the offer haunted her. Even the respectable women in town now saw her as someone who might need to flee her own home. The thought made her stomach turn, but she couldn't honestly say the suggestion was completely unreasonable. After all, she really didn't know what Jake was hiding from her. On Wednesday evening, Lisa made a decision that would change everything. Jake had left for the barn as usual, claiming he wanted to finish up some detail work before the weather turned cold again. Lisa waited until she heard the familiar sounds of hammering and sawing, then quietly put on her coat and stepped out into the crisp autumn air. She had tried to respect Jake's privacy, tried to trust him as a good wife should, but the not knowing was eating her alive, and the community's suspicions were poisoning her marriage day by day. She needed to see for herself what was worth risking their entire relationship to keep secret. The barn sat about 50 yards from their cabin, an old weathered structure that had probably been built decades before they ever moved to the property. Lisa had passed it hundreds of times during their months of marriage, but tonight it felt like she was approaching something foreign and potentially dangerous. Light spilled out from under the door and through the small gaps in the wooden walls. The sounds of Jake's work were clearer now, the rhythmic scraping of sandpaper, the gentle tap of a hammer, the occasional creak of floorboards as he moved around inside. Strangely, these ordinary sounds made her feel even more nervous. What kind of innocent project required such elaborate secrecy? Lisa walked slowly around the perimeter of the barn, looking for some way to see inside without confronting Jake directly. The windows were still covered with heavy canvas, but she noticed that one section had come loose at the bottom corner. Her heart pounding, she carefully lifted the edge of the fabric and peered through the gap. What she saw in that first glimpse stopped her breath completely. The interior of the barn had been transformed into something that looked more like a woodworking shop than a storage space. Neat rows of tools hung on the walls, and workbenches lined the sides of the room. But it was the object in the center of the space that made Lisa's knees go weak. There, illuminated by several oil lamps, sat the most beautiful wooden cradle she had ever seen. Lisa blinked hard, sure she must be seeing things wrong. But no matter how many times she looked, the scene remained the same. Jake was kneeling beside the cradle, carefully sanding one of its curved rockers with infinite patience. The wood gleamed like honey in the lamplight, and Lisa could see intricate, carved details covering every surface. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Delicate flowers wound around the headboard, and tiny birds seemed to dance along the sides. The rockers were smooth and perfectly balanced, designed to provide the gentlest motion imaginable. This wasn't just furniture, it was a work of art, created with a level of love and skill that took Lisa's breath away. But as the initial shock of discovery wore off, a different emotion began to take its place. Confusion gave way to hurt, then to something approaching anger. A cradle. Jake had been building a cradle. All those hours of secrecy, all those mysterious packages, all the locks and covered windows, it had all been to hide a baby's cradle, Lisa's. First thought was relief that her husband wasn't involved in anything dangerous or illegal. But that relief was quickly overwhelmed by a crushing sense of betrayal. Why would Jake build a cradle without talking to her first? They had never discussed having children. She wasn't pregnant, and as far as she knew, Jake had no reason to think she might be. The implications of what she was seeing made her head spin. Was this Jake's way of telling her he wanted children? Was he assuming she would just go along with his plans without being consulted? Or worse, was this some kind of desperate attempt to trap her in their marriage by forcing a pregnancy? Lisa's hands shook as she continued to watch her husband work. He was completely absorbed in his task, running his fingers along the wood to check for rough spots, adjusting the position of the carved decorations, testing the balance of the rockers. There was something almost reverent in the way he touched the cradle, like he was handling something sacred. But to Lisa, standing in the cold darkness outside the barn, the scene felt more like a violation than a gift. This cradle represented huge decisions about their future that Jake had apparently made without her input. Every careful detail, every hour of secret work, had been done while assuming she would simply accept whatever he had planned for their lives. The longer she watched, the more upset she became. She thought about all the nights she had lain awake worrying about what Jake might be hiding. All the rumors and whispered concerns from the townspeople. All the stress and sleepless nights and growing distance between them. And it had all been because Jake was making plans for children they had never agreed to have. Lisa's eyes filled with tears as she continued to spy on her husband through the gap in the canvas. Part of her recognized the love and hope that had gone into creating such a beautiful piece, but another part of her felt manipulated and deceived. How could Jake have kept something this significant from her? How could he have let her worry and doubt and suffer through weeks of uncertainty rather than simply talking to her about his dreams for their future? As she watched, Jake stood up and stepped back to examine his work. Even from her limited viewpoint, Lisa could see the pride and satisfaction on his face. He was clearly pleased with what he had accomplished, completely unaware that his wife was watching from outside, her heart breaking with every passing minute. The cradle was lined with soft fabric in pale yellow and cream colors. Lisa could see tiny pillows and what looked like a small quilt folded neatly inside. Jake had thought of everything, down to the smallest details that would make this cradle perfect for a baby. Their baby, apparently, whether she had agreed to have one or not. Lisa pulled back from the window, unable to watch any longer. She felt sick to her stomach and angry beyond words. This wasn't the romantic surprise Jake probably thought it was. This was presumptuous and manipulative and completely unfair to her. She stood in the darkness outside the barn, trying to process what she had discovered. The beautiful craftsmanship couldn't hide the fact that Jake had made major assumptions about their future without consulting her. He had spent months working on this project, while she worried about his strange behavior, and endured the community's growing suspicions about their marriage. The worst part was realizing that Jake had probably been enjoying his secret. While she lay awake at night wondering if her husband might be dangerous, he had been contentedly working on his surprise gift, completely oblivious to the pain his secrecy was causing her. Lisa wiped her tears and quietly made her way back to the cabin. She needed time to think about what she had seen and what it meant for their marriage. The relief of knowing Jake wasn't involved in anything sinister was overshadowed by the realization that he had been making plans for their future without including her. In the decision-making process, she sat alone in their living room. Waiting for Jake to return from the barn, Lisa felt more confused and hurt than ever. The mystery was solved, but the solution had created entirely new problems. How could she confront Jake about what she had seen without admitting she had spied on him? And more importantly, how could they move forward when it was clear they had very different ideas about communication and shared decision-making in their marriage? When Jake finally came through the door, sawdust in his hair and satisfaction on his face, Lisa looked at him with new eyes. She saw the man she loved, but she also saw someone who had kept a secret that affected both their lives. The cradle in the barn was beautiful, but the way Jake had gone about creating it had damaged something precious between them. How did the work go tonight? Lisa spent the entire next day at school in a fog of confusion and hurt. Every time she tried to focus on her lessons, her mind wandered back to the image of that beautiful cradle sitting in the barn. The children noticed her distraction, and several of them asked if she was feeling sick again. By the time the school day ended, Lisa knew she couldn't go home and pretend. Everything was normal for another evening. The walk back to the cabin felt like the longest journey of her life. With each step, she rehearsed different ways to confront Jake about what she had discovered. Should she admit she had spied on him? Should she demand an explanation for his secretiveness? Should she ask him directly about his plans for children? Every approach seemed to lead to an argument, and Lisa dreaded the confrontation that was coming. Jake was already home when she arrived, sitting at their kitchen table with a cup of coffee and yesterday's newspaper. He looked up with his usual warm smile when she walked through the door, completely unaware that his wife knew his secret. "How was school today, sweetheart?" he asked, folding the paper and giving her his full attention. "Fine," Lisa replied, her voice sounding strained even to her own ears. She hung up her coat and moved to the stove to start preparing dinner, needing something to do with her hands while she worked up the courage to speak. They went through their usual evening routine, but the atmosphere felt different, Lisa found herself studying Jake's face, looking for signs of guilt or deception. She noticed how he kept glancing toward the barn through the kitchen window, and how he seemed eager to finish his meal quickly. After dinner, Jake pushed back from the table and stretched. "I think I'll head out to the barn for a while. Getting close to finishing up that project I've been working on." This was Lisa's moment. Her heart pounded as she turned to face her husband. "Jake, we need to talk." Something in her tone made Jake freeze halfway out of his chair. He sat back down slowly, his expression growing serious. "What about, Lisa?" "About what you've been doing in that barn. About all the secrets and the packages and the way you've been acting for months now." Jake's face went pale. "Lisa, I told you, it's just a project. Something I'm making for ... For what, Jake?" Lisa interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "For later? For someday?" Those aren't real answers, and I'm tired of being kept in the dark about my own life." They stared at each other across the small kitchen table. Lisa could see Jake wrestling with himself, the same internal battle she'd witnessed before. Finally, he took a deep breath and seemed to come to a decision. "You're right," he said quietly. "You deserve to know the truth. I never meant for things to go on this long or for you to feel shut out. I wanted everything to be perfect before I showed you." "Showed me what, Jake?" Jake stood up from the table and walked to the window overlooking the barn. For a long moment he stood with his back to her, his shoulders tense. When he finally spoke, his voice was so soft she had to strain to hear him. "I've been building a cradle, Lisa, the most beautiful cradle I could possibly make." Even though Lisa had already known what she would hear, the words still hit her like a physical blow. "A cradle," she repeated flatly. Jake turned around, and Lisa was shocked to see tears in his eyes. "I know we've never talked about children. I know I should have discussed it with you first. But Lisa, I've wanted to be a father for as long as I can remember, and I was so afraid." "Afraid of what?" Jake sat back down heavily, running his hands through his hair. "Afraid that if I brought it up, you'd realize you'd made a mistake marrying me. Afraid that you'd think about what kind of father a man like me would make, and decide you wanted something different." Lisa felt her anger wavering in the face of Jake's obvious pain, but she wasn't ready to let go of her hurt feelings. "So instead of talking to me like your wife, you decided to just build a cradle and hope I'd go along with whatever you had planned." "No," Jake said quickly. "It wasn't like that. I wasn't trying to pressure you or force anything. I just thought I wanted to have something ready. Something that would show you how much I want this, how much thought I've put into it." "But Jake, building a cradle doesn't show me anything except that you made major decisions about our future without including me." "How am I supposed to feel about that?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands folded on the table. When he looked up, his eyes were filled with a vulnerability that Lisa had never seen before. "Do you know why I never had friends growing up, Lisa? Why people in this town always thought I was strange and difficult?" The sudden change of subject confused her. "Because of the accident, the scar? That was part of it, but not the whole story." Jake's voice grew softer, more hesitant. "My father left when I was 6 years old. Just up and disappeared one day, without a word to me or my mother. She died when I was 16, and I've been on my own ever since." Lisa felt her heart clench at the pain in Jake's voice, but she didn't interrupt. "I used to lie awake at night when I was little, wondering what was wrong with me that made my father leave. Was I too loud? Too difficult? Not smart enough? Not good enough? My mother tried to tell me it wasn't my fault, but I never really believed her." Jake stood up again and began pacing around the small kitchen. "When I grew up and started thinking about having a family of my own, I swore I would be different. I would be the kind of father who stayed, who cared, who made sure his children knew they were wanted and loved." Lisa began to understand where this was leading, and her anger started to soften despite her efforts to hold on to it. "I've been working on that cradle for months, Lisa, putting everything I have into making it perfect. Every detail, every curve, every carved flower represents the love I want to give to our children someday. It's not just furniture, it's a promise. A promise that any child who sleeps in that cradle will be cherished and protected and never, ever abandoned." Tears were streaming down Jake's face now, and Lisa felt her own eyes filling up. She was beginning to see the cradle in a completely different light. "But why couldn't you just tell me that from the beginning?" she asked, her voice much gentler now. Jake sat back down and reached across the table for her hands. "Because I was terrified that if I told you how much I wanted children, you'd think about what the people in this town say about me. You'd remember that I come from broken people, that I've never had a real family of my own. You'd worry that I don't know how to be a good father because I never had one myself." Lisa felt her last bit of anger dissolve completely. She was beginning to understand the depth of fear and insecurity that had driven Jake's secretiveness. "Jake," she said softly, "do you really think I would judge you for wanting children? Do you think I would hold your father's failures against you? I don't know, Jake admitted. I hope not. But Lisa, you have to understand, you're the first good thing that's ever happened to me. The first person who looked at me and saw something worth loving. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you because of my damaged family history. Lisa pulled her hands free from Jake's and walked around the table to him. She knelt beside his chair and took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. Jake Thompson, you listen to me. Your father's decision to leave had nothing to do with you and everything to do with his own weaknesses. You are not damaged goods, and you are not destined to repeat his mistakes. But how can you be sure? Jake whispered. Because I've seen. Your heart? Lisa replied firmly. I've watched you gentle frightened horses and help elderly ladies and treat me with more kindness than I ever dreamed possible. I've seen you reading poetry and dreaming about the future. A man like that doesn't abandon his family. Jake wrapped his arms around Lisa and held her tightly. They stayed like that for several minutes, both of them crying and finally beginning to heal the wounds that secrets and misunderstandings had created. I want to see it, Lisa finally said. What? The cradle. I want to see what you've been working on all these months. Jake pulled back to look at her face. Are you sure? Even after everything I've put you through? Lisa smiled through her tears. Especially after everything you've just told me. Jake, I want children too. I've wanted them since I was a little girl playing with dolls. I just never knew how to bring it up either. The relief that washed over Jake's face was beautiful to see. Really? You really want to have a family with me? More than anything, Lisa said. But next time we make major life decisions, we're going to talk about them together first. Like married people should? Jake laughed, the first genuinely happy sound Lisa had heard from him in weeks. Deal. No more secrets, I promise. Hand in hand, they walked out to the barn together. When Jake unlocked the door and lit the oil lamps, Lisa gasped at what she saw. The cradle was even more beautiful than she had realized during her quick glimpse through the window. Every surface was smooth as silk, every carved detail perfect in its execution. Oh, Jake, she breathed, running her fingers along the intricate woodwork. It's absolutely gorgeous. You really like it? Jake asked anxiously. Like it? I love it. But more than that, I love what it represents. I love knowing that our children will sleep in something made with such care and hope. As they stood together admiring Jake's masterpiece, Lisa finally understood the true meaning behind all those months of secrecy. This cradle wasn't just a piece of furniture. The morning after Jake and Lisa's tearful reconciliation in the barn, something fundamental had shifted in their small cabin on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge. For the first time in months, Lisa woke up feeling truly at peace with her husband sleeping beside her. The secrets were finally out in the open, and the beautiful cradle that had once seemed like a symbol of betrayal now represented everything hopeful about their future together. Jake seemed different too. The weight of carrying his secret alone had lifted from his shoulders, and he moved through their morning routine with a lightness Lisa hadn't seen since their early days of marriage. Over breakfast, they talked openly about their dreams for children, sharing stories from their own childhoods and making plans for the family they both wanted to build. I was thinking, Jake said as he finished his coffee, maybe we should bring the cradle into the house. Put it in the spare room for now. I'm tired of hiding it away like something shameful. Lisa smiled and reached across the table to squeeze his hand. I'd like that. And Jake? I think we should tell people the truth about what you've been building. Let them see for themselves what kind of man you really are. The opportunity came sooner than they expected. That very afternoon, Frank stopped by the cabin to check on them, just as he had been doing regularly since the rumors about Jake's strange behavior had started circulating around town. You two look better, Frank observed as he settled into a chair on their small porch. More like yourselves again. Jake and Lisa exchanged a meaningful glance. Actually, Frank, Jake said, there's something we'd like to show you. Something I've been working on that I think you'll appreciate. Frank's eyebrows rose with curiosity as Jake led the way to the barn. When the old foreman saw the exquisite cradle sitting in the lamplight, his weathered face broke into the widest smile Lisa had ever seen. "Well, I'll be damned," Frank breathed, running his rough fingers along the smooth wood. "Jake, this is the finest piece of craftsmanship I've ever laid eyes on. How long have you been working on this?" "About 6 months," Jake admitted. "Every evening after work and most weekends." Frank shook his head in amazement. "And here the whole town's been whispering about you acting strange and secretive. If they could see this—" He trailed off, then looked directly at Jake. "Son, this is something to be proud of, not something to hide away." "I know that now," Jake said, glancing at Lisa. "I was just scared, I guess. Scared of what people might think or say." Frank laughed, a sound filled with genuine affection. "Jake Thompson, in all the years I've known you, this is the most normal thing you've ever done. What man doesn't dream of building something beautiful for his future children?" Word of the Cradle's existence spread through Cedar Ridge almost as quickly as the previous rumors had. But this time the gossip carried a very different tone. Mrs. Patterson, who had always been kind to Jake, made a point of stopping by the cabin to see the masterpiece for herself. "Oh, my stars," she exclaimed when Jake proudly showed her his work. "This is absolutely gorgeous, dear. Your children are going to be so blessed to have a father who put this much love into preparing for them." Even some of the women who had been most critical of Lisa's marriage choices found themselves reconsidering their opinions. When Carolyn, the skeptical teacher, heard about the Cradle from Mrs. Patterson, she was forced to admit that perhaps she had misjudged Jake's character. "I suppose I owe you an apology," Carolyn said to Lisa after school one day. "I may have been too quick to assume the worst about your husband. A man who spends months crafting something that beautiful for his future children. Well, that's not the behavior of someone dangerous or unstable." The transformation in how the community viewed Jake was remarkable to witness. People who had crossed the street to avoid him for years suddenly found excuses to visit the cabin and see the famous Cradle. The mayor's wife, who had once offered Lisa a place to escape to, now spoke admiringly about Jake's artistic talents. Even the pastor seemed to regard Jake with new respect, but perhaps the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. Dr. Miller, the town's physician, had heard about the Cradle and asked if he could see it. When Jake showed him the piece, the doctor was so impressed that he made an unusual request. "My daughter in the state capitol is expecting her first child," Dr. Miller explained. "I've seen a lot of baby furniture over the years, but nothing approaching this quality. Would you consider taking on a commission?" "I'd pay whatever you think is fair." Jake was stunned. "You want me to build another cradle?" "I want you to build a lot of cradles," Dr. Miller replied. "Word of your skill is already spreading beyond Cedar Ridge. Mark my words, you could make a good living doing this kind of work." The idea had never occurred to Jake, but as he thought about it, the possibility began to excite him. He could continue his ranch work during the day and build furniture in the evenings, creating beautiful pieces for families throughout the region. It would be a way to support his own growing family while bringing joy to others. 3 months after their reconciliation, Lisa discovered she was pregnant. The timing felt perfectly right, as if their marriage had needed to go through its trial by fire before they were ready to become parents. When she told Jake the news, he swept her up in his arms and spun her around their small kitchen, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. "Our baby is going to sleep in the most beautiful cradle in the world," Lisa said, as Jake gently placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "Our baby is going to be the luckiest child in the world," Jake replied, "because they're going to have you for a mother." As Lisa's pregnancy progressed, the community that had once whispered about her marriage now rallied around the young couple. Women who had previously been skeptical offered advice and baby clothes. Men who had once avoided Jake now sought him out to discuss his woodworking techniques and place orders for their own furniture pieces. The most touching moment came when Mrs. Henderson, Lisa's former landlady, who had been one of the most vocal critics of the marriage, showed up at their door with a bag of baby clothes she had knitted herself. "I owe you both an apology," she said, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I let my assumptions and the town gossip cloud my judgment. You've got yourself a good man, Lisa and Jake. You've got yourself a woman worth fighting for." When their son was born on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Jake had proposed, the entire town seemed to celebrate with them. The baby was healthy and beautiful, with Jake's blue eyes and Lisa's gentle temperament. And yes, he slept in the most exquisite cradle anyone in Cedar Ridge had ever seen. Frank was one of the first visitors to meet the new baby. As he held the tiny boy in his weathered arms, he looked at Jake with unmistakable pride. "You know, son," Frank said softly, "I always knew you had it in you to be a great father. You just needed to believe it yourself." Jake's woodworking business flourished as word of his exceptional craftsmanship spread throughout the territory. Orders poured in from families far and wide, all wanting Jake Thompson to create something special for their children. The man who had once been the outcast of Cedar Ridge became one of its most respected craftsmen, but more than the professional success, it was the personal vindication that meant the most to Jake and Lisa, their love story, which had begun with so much doubt. And opposition from the community had proved stronger than gossip and prejudice. They had faced down the worst assumptions people could make about them and emerged with their marriage not just intact, but stronger than ever years later. When their children were grown and had children of their own, people in Cedar Ridge would still tell the story of Jake and Lisa Thompson. It became a local legend about the power of looking beyond surface appearances, about the danger of judging too quickly, and about how sometimes the person everyone thinks is wrong for you turns out to be exactly right. The beautiful cradle that started it all was passed down through generations of Thompson children, each one sleeping peacefully in the masterpiece their grandfather had crafted with such love and hope. And carved into the bottom of the cradle, in Jake's careful handwriting, were the words that had guided his entire approach to fatherhood: never forgotten, always cherished, forever loved. The man nobody wanted had become the husband everyone envied, and the marriage everyone doubted had become the love story everyone wanted to hear. In the end, Jake and Lisa's greatest triumph wasn't proving the town wrong about their relationship. It was proving to themselves that real love could overcome any obstacle, even the cruelest judgment of all.